In the unforgiving landscape of 1885 Wyoming Territory, some transactions reveal the darkest corners of humanity. What is a human life worth? For Mary Harper, it was the price of a gambling debt and a pair of leather gloves. But sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Thomas Blackwood, a man haunted by his own past, witnesses something he cannot ignore. A young woman being traded like cattle in broad daylight. One decision changes everything. When this lonely rancher intervenes and promises that Mary will never be bartered again, he sets in motion a powerful story of redemption, dignity, and unexpected love. Join us for this authentic American frontier tale where two broken souls find healing together against all odds. This isn't just another Western, it's a deeply human story about finding worth, freedom, and second chances in a world that shows little mercy. If you're moved by stories of courage and transformation in America's past, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single chapter of this powerful journey. Drop a like on this video to help others discover this story, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Thomas's position? Would you have had the courage to step forward? Your support means everything to this channel, and together, we'll explore more untold stories from our shared history. Subscribe now, the next chapter arrives next week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when Mary's past comes back to haunt them both. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cottonwood Springs, a small frontier settlement in Wyoming Territory, 1885. Dust swirled through the air as Thomas Blackwood tied his chestnut mare to the hitching post outside Mason's General Store. At 42, Thomas's face was weathered from years under the harsh western sun, his eyes a steely blue that had seen too much of life's cruelties. The last 15 years he'd spent alone on his cattle ranch outside town, speaking more to his livestock than to people. "Just need supplies and I'm gone," he muttered to himself, adjusting his worn Stetson before pushing through the door. The bell jingled overhead as he entered, nodding curtly to Mason behind the counter. "Afternoon, Blackwood," Mason said, barely looking up from his ledger. "Your usual orders ready." Thomas grunted acknowledgement and began inspecting the items. He needed to get back to the ranch before nightfall. Spring calving season was in full swing, and he couldn't afford to waste daylight. The commotion outside drew his attention before he could finish checking his supplies. Raised voices and the sound of a woman's quiet sobbing filtered through the thin walls. Thomas tried to ignore it. Other people's business wasn't his concern, but something in the desperate tone of the woman's voice pulled him toward the window. Through the dust-streaked glass, he saw a young woman, perhaps 20, standing between two men. One was clearly her father, a gaunt, desperate-looking fellow with the sallow complexion of a man who'd found more comfort in whiskey than honest work. The other was Silas Garrett, a local rancher with a reputation that made even hardened men cross the street when they saw him coming. "Deal's a deal, Harper," Silas was saying, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "Your debt's cleared with the girl. Mary here will work it off." The young woman, Mary, stood with her head bowed, silent tears streaming down her face. Her threadbare dress hung loosely on her thin frame, her hands clasped tightly together to stop their trembling. "But I thought," her father stammered, already edging toward the saloon. "Didn't we agree on more?" Silas pulled a pair of fine leather gloves from his coat pocket and tossed them carelessly at Harper's feet. "Consider it a bonus. Now get before I change my mind about forgiving that gambling debt." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen his share of ugly transactions on the frontier, but this was a new low. Trading a human being, someone's daughter, for a gambling debt and a pair of gloves. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Thomas was pushing through the door and striding across the dusty street. 3 heads turned toward him in surprise. "What's your business here, Blackwood?" Silas asked, his hand drifting casually toward his holstered pistol. Thomas ignored him, looking instead at Harper. "How much?" "What?" Harper blinked in confusion. "The debt. How much does he owe you, Garrett?" Silas laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Ain't for sale, Blackwood. Deal's done." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. $50. Plus whatever supplies you need, Harper, to get yourself to the next town and start fresh." He fixed the man with a hard stare. "But you leave the girl with me." 75, Silas countered, his eyes narrowing. 60, Thomas replied. "And you know that's more than fair for a debt won in a crooked game." Silas's face darkened, but greed won out over pride. He snatched the pouch from Thomas's hand, weighing it briefly before pocketing it. "Your funeral, Blackwood. Girl's more trouble than she's worth." With that, he turned and stalked away, the leather gloves forgotten in the dirt. Thomas turned to Mary, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and confusion, her blue eyes wide in her pale face. "Miss," he said, softening his voice, "I'm Thomas Blackwood. I have a ranch about 5 miles outside town. I'm offering you honest work, cooking, cleaning, whatever you can manage. Your own cabin, fair wages." He paused. "No one will harm you there. You have my word." Mary glanced at her father, who was already stumbling toward the saloon doors, the transaction forgotten. When she looked back at Thomas, there was something new in her eyes, a flicker of hope, fragile as a candle flame in a windstorm. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked down at the forgotten gloves in the dirt, then back at her. "Because no person should be bartered like cattle, and I promise you this, you'll never be traded away again." As they walked toward his wagon, Thomas wondered what madness had possessed him. He'd lived alone for 15 years, content with his solitude. Now he was bringing a stranger, a young woman with a world of troubles, into his carefully ordered life. Yet watching Mary climb carefully onto the wagon seat, her movements betraying both caution and dignity, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Some things a man couldn't witness without acting, not if he wanted to call himself a man at all. The journey to Blackwood Ranch passed in silence. Mary sat rigid beside Thomas, clutching her small bundle of possessions, all she had in the world, as the wagon bumped along the rutted trail. The rolling landscape of Wyoming territory stretched around them, vast and indifferent, golden grasses bending under the evening breeze. Thomas cleared his throat several times, searching for words, but finding none that seemed adequate. What did you say to a woman you'd essentially purchased? Even if his intentions were honorable, the circumstances were not. As they crested the final hill, the ranch came into view, a sturdy 2-story cabin with a wide porch, a barn, corral, and several outbuildings, all nestled in a protected valley with a creek running through it. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and smoke curled from the cabin's chimney. Mrs. Winters, the widow from town, who came twice weekly to help with housekeeping, must have lit a fire before leaving. "This is it," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." Mary's eyes took in everything, revealing nothing of her thoughts. "It's bigger than I expected," she finally said. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop near the smaller cabin, about 50 yards from the main house. "This was built for a foreman, but I've never hired one. It's yours now. It's simple, but sound. Stove works, roof doesn't leak." He helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her more than necessary. Her wariness was palpable, and he had no desire to increase it. "I'll bring you some food from the main house," he said. "Get settled in. We can talk about duties tomorrow." Mary nodded, still clutching her bundle. "Mr. Blackwood," she said as he turned to go, "I don't know why you did what you did today, but thank you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Get some rest, Miss Harper." "It's Mary," she said. "Just Mary now? I don't want his name anymore." Thomas nodded in understanding. "Mary, then." Later that night, after bringing her food and showing her where everything was in the cabin, Thomas sat on his porch watching the stars emerge. What had he done? He knew nothing about this woman, except that she'd been treated as property her whole life. He didn't know if she could cook or clean, or help with the endless chores a cattle ranch required. He didn't know if she'd run at the first opportunity. More importantly, he didn't know how to be around people anymore, especially not a woman with fear in her eyes. The next morning, Thomas was up before dawn as usual, tending to the cattle and checking on a new calf born the previous day. When he returned to the main house for breakfast, he was startled to find smoke coming from the chimney and the smell of coffee in the air. Mary stood at his stove, her hair tied back, wearing one of Mrs. Winter's aprons that she must have found in the cupboard. It swallowed her thin frame. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the stove. I thought I should earn my keep. You didn't have to, Thomas began. Yes, I did, she interrupted, a flash of something, pride perhaps, crossing her face. I'm not charity, Mr. Blackwood. I'll work for what you've given me. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding. All right then, but it's Thomas. Mr. Blackwood makes me feel like my father. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Thomas. Over the next few weeks, they established an uneasy routine. Mary proved to be a capable cook and housekeeper, though Thomas insisted she focus on the main house and leave the barn and ranch work to him. She was too thin, too pale, and he suspected her father's home had not been a kind one. One evening, as spring gave way to early summer, Thomas returned from town with supplies and a package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? Mary asked when he handed it to her. Open it and see, he replied gruffly. Inside was fabric, good calico in a soft blue color, and a ready-made dress in a similar shade that looked to be her size. Mrs. Wilson at the mercantile helped me choose, he explained awkwardly. Thought you might need something more. Mary ran her fingers over the fabric, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Thomas feared he'd offended her. No one's ever given me something just because I needed it, she finally said, her voice tight with emotion. Always had to trade something for it. There's no trade, Thomas said firmly. It's yours. That night, after Mary had returned to her cabin, Thomas sat cleaning his rifle on the porch. The summer night was alive with sounds, crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through cottonwoods along the creek. He thought about Mary's words. Always had to trade something for it. Each day revealed new glimpses of the life she'd fled, and each revelation stoked a slow, burning anger in him. Not just at her father, or men like Silas Garrett, but at a world that allowed such things to happen. Thomas had left his own ghosts behind in Tennessee after the war. A wife and infant son claimed by fever while he was away fighting. For 15 years, he'd lived with that guilt, that emptiness. He'd come west to disappear, to exist without truly living. Now, watching the lamplight glow in the window of Mary's cabin, he wondered if perhaps they'd both been given a second chance at something like life. By late summer, the initial awkwardness between Thomas and Mary had given way to a comfortable routine. Mary had transformed the main house, bringing order to rooms that had seen little care since Thomas's wife died. She'd planted a small vegetable garden behind her cabin and tended to the few chickens Thomas kept for eggs. Her cooking had improved from merely adequate to genuinely good as she gained confidence and better ingredients. More significantly, the haunted look in her eyes had begun to fade. She still startled at sudden movements and avoided riding into town, but she smiled more often. Sometimes Thomas even heard her humming as she worked. Thomas found himself looking forward to their shared meals, to the simple conversation that had once felt so forced. Mary was intelligent and observant, eager to learn about the ranch operations. He'd begun teaching her to ride, surprised by her determination despite her obvious fear of horses. My father traded our only horse for whiskey when I was 12, she explained one day as she cautiously brushed Thomas's gentle mare. Said women had no business riding anyway. Such revelations came more frequently now, small windows into her past that helped Thomas understand her better. Each one strengthened his resolve that she would never return to that life. The fragile peace they had established shattered on a sweltering August afternoon. Thomas had ridden out at dawn to check on the herd, leaving Mary to her usual chores. He returned earlier than expected, the oppressive heat driving him back to the shade of the house. As he approached, he heard voices, Mary's, raised in alarm, and a man's, slurred with drink. Thomas urged his horse faster, rounding the corner of the barn to see Mary backing away from her father, Harper, who had somehow found his way to the ranch. The man looked even worse than before, filthy, unshaven, with the desperate look of a man in the grip of both alcohol and withdrawal. "You're coming with me, girl," Harper was saying, swaying on his feet. "Found a fella up near Casper willing to settle my debts. Says he needs a wife. Don't care what she looks like." "I'm not going anywhere," Mary replied, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "This is my home now." Harper laughed, an ugly sound. "Home? You stupid girl. You belong to me. Always have." "No, she doesn't," Thomas said, dismounting in one fluid motion. His hand rested near his holstered revolver. Mary belongs to herself now. Harper spun around, nearly losing his balance. Blackwood! Been looking for you. I want her back. Whatever you paid, I'll return it when— There's nothing to return, Thomas interrupted, moving to stand beside Mary. Mary works here of her own free will. She can leave any time she chooses. That true, girl? Harper demanded. You choosing this old man over your own blood? Mary straightened her shoulders, meeting her father's gaze directly. Yes, I choose here. I choose my freedom. Ungrateful whore, Harper spat, lunging toward her. Thomas moved faster than he had in years, catching the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. That's enough, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You're leaving now, and you're never coming back. Or what? Harper challenged, though his bravado was undercut by the pain in his voice. Or I'll have the sheriff charge you with trespassing, assault, and attempting to traffic your own daughter, Thomas replied. Judge Parker doesn't look kindly on men who sell women, even their daughters, especially their daughters. The fight seemed to drain out of Harper then. Thomas marched him to his scraggly horse tied at the fence and helped him mount none too gently. Don't come back, Thomas warned. Next time won't end so peacefully. They watched in silence as Harper rode away, a pathetic figure diminishing in the distance. I'm sorry, Mary said when he was finally out of sight. I never thought he'd find me here. Not your fault, Thomas replied. Are you all right? Mary nodded, but her hands were still shaking. Without thinking, Thomas reached out and took them in his own, steadying them. I meant what I said. You're free to stay or go as you choose. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Mary looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I want to stay. I've never felt safe anywhere before. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in a shades of orange and pink, Mary spoke more about her past than she ever had before. She told Thomas about growing up with a father who saw her only as a commodity, who'd tried to trade her off twice before. Once to a passing trader when she was just 14, and once to a miner who'd struck a small vein of silver. I ran away both times, she said, but he always found me, and the beatings got worse. By the time you saw us in town, I didn't have the strength to run anymore. Thomas listened in silence, his jaw tight with anger at what she'd endured. Why didn't you ever marry? Mary asked suddenly, changing the subject. 15 years is a long time to be alone. Thomas was quiet for so long that Mary thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. I was married once, back in Tennessee. Her name was Rebecca. We had a son, just a baby, when I left to fight in the war. While I was gone, fever took them both. He paused, the memory still painful after all these years. When I came home, there was nothing left for me there. Came west thinking I might die out here, and not minding much if I did. And now? Mary asked softly. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the frightened girl he'd rescued, but the strong woman she was becoming. Now I mind, he said simply. Autumn came to Wyoming territory in a blaze of color. The cottonwoods along the creek turned golden, and crisp mornings gave way to sun-warmed afternoons. Thomas and Mary fell into a new rhythm, their shared work bringing them closer with each passing day. Thomas found himself smiling more, talking more. Sometimes he'd catch himself watching Mary as she worked in the garden or fed the chickens, admiring the quiet strength she'd developed. She'd gained weight, her cheeks filling out, her skin taking on a healthy glow. The blue dress he'd bought her now fit properly, and she'd made another from the fabric, displaying a talent for sewing he hadn't known she possessed. More remarkably, she'd begun riding into town with him occasionally, her head held high despite the curious looks and whispered gossip. Mrs. Wilson at the Mercantile had taken a liking to her, and Mary had even begun helping the widow Winters with her reading, the older woman never having had the opportunity to learn as a child. People will talk, Thomas had warned her before their first trip together. Mary had simply shrugged. Let them. We know the truth. The truth was complicated, though. Thomas couldn't deny his growing feelings for Mary, nor the way his heart lightened when she smiled at him. But he was 20 years her senior, and she'd had so little choice in her life. He wouldn't take advantage of her gratitude or her vulnerability, wouldn't have her trade one form of obligation for another. So he kept his feelings to himself, content with their friendship and the family they'd begun to form, unconventional though it was. One cool October evening, Thomas returned from a long day moving cattle to the lower pastures for winter. He was bone-tired, his old injuries aching with the promise of coming snow. The smell of beef stew greeted him as he entered the main house, along with the unexpected sound of laughter. Mary was at the stove, stirring the pot while chatting with Mrs. Winters, who rarely stayed past sundown. The older woman was showing Mary how to make biscuits, their hands dusted with flour. "Thomas!" Mary exclaimed when she saw him. "Mrs. Winters is teaching me her biscuit recipe. She's staying for supper." "Glad to hear it," Thomas said, hanging his hat by the door. The domestic scene before him stirred something in his chest, a longing for what he'd lost, for what he'd never thought to have again. The meal was one of the best Thomas could remember having in years. Mrs. Winters kept them entertained with stories of Cottonwood Springs in its early days, and Mary spoke animatedly about her plans for expanding the garden next spring. "You'll need to build a proper fence," Mrs. Winters told Thomas. "Keep the rabbits out." "I'll add it to my list," Thomas replied with a smile. After Mrs. Winters left, insisting she could make it home before dark, Thomas helped Mary clear the table. Their hands brushed as they worked, and Thomas felt a jolt of awareness that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. "I have something for you," Mary said when they'd finished, suddenly looking nervous. She disappeared into the pantry and returned with a package wrapped in plain paper. "What's this?" Thomas asked, echoing her words from months ago. "Open it and see," she replied with a small smile. Inside was a new shirt, made from fabric she must have purchased on one of their trips to town. The stitching was neat and even, the collar perfectly turned. "You made this?" Thomas asked, genuinely impressed. Mary nodded. "Mrs. Winters helped me with the pattern. I wanted to thank you for everything." "You don't owe me thanks, Mary, or anything else." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I wanted to give it, because I chose to, not because I had to." Thomas touched the shirt gently. "It's the finest gift I've received in a very long time." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "Thomas," Mary finally said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." He nodded, suddenly apprehensive. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "Leave?" Thomas repeated, genuinely shocked. "Why would I want that? You've been distant lately. I thought perhaps you regretted bringing me here." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair. "No, Mary, that's not it at all." "Then what is it?" "Because something has changed between us." Thomas sighed, knowing he owed her honesty. "I'm afraid of what I'm beginning to feel for you, afraid of asking something you might not be ready to give." Understanding dawned in Mary's eyes. "You think I can't know my own mind? That I'm still that frightened girl you found in town?" "No," Thomas said. "I know you're not. But I'm still the man who bought you, however good my intentions." Mary stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the lavender she'd begun growing near her cabin. "You didn't buy me, Thomas. You freed me. There's a world of difference." She reached up, placing her hand against his cheek. "I've had men try to own me my whole life. You're the only one who ever saw me as a person, not property." Thomas covered her hand with his own, his heart hammering in his chest. "I promised you'd never be bartered again. I won't ask anything of you that you're not freely choosing to give." "Then ask," Mary said simply, "because I've already chosen." Later that night, they sat on the porch swing Thomas had built over the summer, a quilt wrapped around their shoulders against the autumn chill. The stars stretched endlessly above them, brilliant in the clear mountain air. "I never thought I'd find peace again," Thomas said, his arm around Mary's shoulders. "After Rebecca and my son died, I thought that part of my life was over." "And now?" Mary asked, echoing her question from months before. Thomas smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Now I know some promises are worth keeping, even when you don't know where they'll lead." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the valley. Soon winter would come, bringing snow and long nights, but they would face it together, two broken people who had somehow found wholeness in each other. When spring comes, Thomas said, I thought we might ride into Cheyenne. Find a proper preacher. Mary looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Blackwood? I'm asking if you'd choose me, freely and completely. Not because I rescued you or gave you a home, but because you want to build a life together. Yes, Mary said without hesitation. I choose you. I choose us. As their lips met in a gentle kiss, Thomas knew he had kept his promise. Mary would never be bartered or traded again. What they shared now was freely given. A bond formed not from obligation, but from respect, understanding, and love that had grown slowly and surely as the seasons changed around them. In the quiet Wyoming night, two souls once adrift had finally found harbor in each other. The end.